You've probably heard of the document Children First. Is everybody familiar with that document? It was first issued in 1999, and it was recently, as Minister Fitzgerald said there, reissued in the summer. It has three purposes. Its purpose is to help people to understand what child abuse is. What do we mean when we're talking about child abuse? To know what to do if they become aware of it, and to ensure that all organisations working with children follow the same procedures. With the previous kind of things like the Kelly Fitzgerald case, the McColgan family case, the Lavinia Kerwick case, lots of different people had bits of information, but there was no common procedure for what to do with that information. If you're interested in reading further on those guidelines, you can get them on the Department of Children and Youth Affairs website. You can just download that. The 1999 Children First document really was it was a landmark document in terms of child protection in Ireland. It was the first time that the categories of abuse had been defined, and it was the first time that coherent practices and procedures were put into place. And as Tommy mentioned, in addition to the 2011 Children First, which isn't very different from the 1999 one, the main problem that they found when they reviewed the 1999 document was that there wasn't consistency of practice and procedure in social work departments, which seems strange in a way, because this was a Department of Health document. But anyway, that was the key finding. So in addition, just during the summer, just after the publication of Children First, the best practice, the practice handbook for social workers that Tommy referred to, was also issued. So that social workers have a common practice handbook, no matter where they're working, to assist with consistency in how referrals are dealt with. I didn't actually know the Minister was going to be here today, but I decided I would quote from what she put in the foreword of Children First, because I think it's such a strong commitment, such a strong declaration of commitment. No childhood should be shattered by abuse. No young life should be lived in the shadow of fear. Guidelines cannot eradicate evil. Audits cannot prevent exploitation. Our task is not to delude ourselves that every malign aspect of humanity can be removed. Rather, it is to ensure that children are protected from the badness in society. Where we fail, our task is to make sure that abusers are caught, punished, and prevented from reoffending. And I think that statement there, it's our task as a society to ensure that children are protected from harm. We can't eliminate the potential of some people to abuse children. Often it's an inherited pattern. But we can be alert as a society, not just in schools, but as a wider society as well. The key principles of Children First are that the welfare of the child is paramount. That's obvious, I suppose, from the title. That early intervention and support should be available. That isn't always available for children, for resourcing reasons and for other reasons. There's a balance between protecting children and respecting the rights of parents, and that's something that's a very delicate balance. If there's a conflict, the rights of the child must come first. And as the Minister mentioned, the constitutional referendum on the rights of the child will probably change that balance again. Social workers do everything they possibly can to avoid separating children from their parents. Some people would say they go too far, and that they maybe keep children in families for too long. The Roscommon inquiry case, for example, those children probably should have been taken out sooner. But it's a very difficult judgment for social workers to make. And even when children do have to be taken out of families, they often will try to place them with aunts or uncles or grandparents or close family members, so that the child isn't too traumatized by being put into a completely different environment. The issue of whether Children First is mandatory. The reason I suppose I'm mentioning Children First is that our own school guidelines will follow on, so I'm not going too far off the point. There was a big debate in the mid-90s about whether we should make reporting of child abuse mandatory. In other words, that any suspicion or concern has to be sent in. They have done that in some countries, and they found that social workers were absolutely overloaded with referrals. Listening to what she was saying there, I think that's probably not the route they're going to go down. It would be very interesting to watch what the legislation says. At the moment, what the government is saying is that they're preparing legislation to provide for Children First to be statutorily underpinned in order to ensure compliance by all organisations working with children. That means it'll be much more difficult for someone to say, well, I have a few concerns, but maybe I'll just shelve that for now and I'll hope it goes away. And the legislation will reflect a broad-based approach with obligations extending beyond reporting to one of overall safeguard of children considered to be at risk. And as Francis Fitzgerald rightly said, that is all of us. That's all of us. If we're concerned about a neighbour's child, if we run a involved in a sports club or an out-of-school activity, and we have concerns about children, we have obligations to refer that on to people who can take care of those children. The context there I won't dwell on really. That was the background. This goes up to the Kilkenny Incest Report in Madonna House, the Kelly Fitzgerald, the little girl in the west of Ireland who was deprived of food and sent to England where she died with relatives. The West of Ireland farmer case, that was the Sophia McColgan family case. Those cases precipitated the introduction of Children First in '99, and then subsequently we have had these series of reports. I probably don't even have them all, but I think I've got most of them. Okay, conscious that I have to keep to my time. What time did I start?
No one touching.
I won't. People will want their coffee. And I don't want to delay the next symposium. So, Children First is, if you like, it's the Bible. You know, any organisation working with children should make sure that its policies and procedures are consistent with Children First. Many of you will know that already from your work with other organisations. In 2002, the Department of Education issued guidelines for primary schools, guidelines on how to deal with child protection concerns, and in 2004 to post-primary schools. But a lot has happened since 2004 and since 2002. So we knew that there was a new Children First coming out. We had to make sure that our guidelines were completely consistent with the 2011 Children First, and we had to update it in terms of changes in legislation. So revised procedures were sent to all schools last week, actually. All principals, primary and post-primary, received a circular telling them that the 2011 guidelines were those that they now have to follow. It's the first time we've had common guidelines for both primary and post-primary schools. And it's important for us to point out that these guidelines apply to everybody working in the school, whether in paid or unpaid capacity. So whether it's the secretarial staff, the cleaning staff, somebody in for an hour doing volunteer work in the school, they all have to be aware of these new procedures. And again, if you want the whole document, you can get it if you go to education.ie and click on school personnel and policies, you'll find it. Schools have a responsibility to provide the highest standard of care for children. I referred to that a little bit already. Every board of management or VEC of a school has to appoint somebody called the designated liaison person. Now, is that terminology, I should have put it first in its full title instead of put the letters. Is the concept of a designated liaison person, is that something people are familiar with? Most people are not. Okay. That's the key person in the school. I'll explain later what it is. I was just going to run through the key responsibilities first of all. The DLP is the person with primary responsibility for passing on concerns to the HSC. Everybody in the school should be familiar with the signs and symptoms of abuse. Yesterday I was working with newly qualified teachers doing work on recognition. How do you know if a child is at risk of abuse? What signs and symptoms are there? Anybody with concerns in the school should inform the DLP. So it's like there's a wheel, if you like. The DLP is the centre of the wheel and everybody else are kind of like the spokes, and they pass on concerns to the DLP. And the DLP then has to notify the HSC if there are grounds for concern. The categories of abuse, again, these were defined initially in 1999 in the first Children First edition. Again, I'm sure you know these categories. Child neglect, willful and circumstantial. Willful neglect is relatively rare. Something like the Kelly Fitzgerald case was an example of willful neglect where the child was starved. Circumstantial neglect is often, as Frances Fitzgerald said, often the result of parents hugely under stress, often suffering from mental health problems or addiction. And again, they are the majority of cases that a school deals with. Emotional abuse is where there's maybe persistent criticism or hostility on the part of a parent or caregiver towards a child. Physical abuse and sexual abuse, I suppose, are self-evident what they are. A school is advised to look out for signs and symptoms of abuse, but there are what are called reasonable grounds for concern. Sometimes teachers would say, I just don't have a good feeling there's something that's worrying me about that child. And if you say, well, what is it? They can't really pin it down. That isn't really enough. A hunch isn't enough. But what is enough for a school to decide to make a referral to the HSC are three things. Disclosure by a child. Obviously, the child tells you directly that they're being beaten or they're being sexually abused by somebody, that has to be referred immediately to the HSE. The second reasonable ground for concern would be account by a witness. Sometimes, I know when I worked as a guidance counsellor, sometimes other children would tell you that their friend was having problems either at home or outside the home. And then the last thing, a pattern of injuries or other indicators of abuse. And if you look at the guidelines, or if you look at Children First, there's an extensive list of signs and symptoms of the different kinds of abuse. And teachers need to be familiar with those. It's important and reassuring, I suppose, for families, because even though parents and families are the primary caregiver, abuse happens within families. It doesn't only happen within families, but it certainly happens within families. So sometimes the parent is the perpetrator of the abuse. In almost all cases, children who experience abuse receive or are the victims of abuse. The perpetrators are somebody that they know reasonably well. Somebody like a neighbour, a family friend, a member of the extended family. Somebody that the child gradually comes to trust. So it's very important for families to know that confidentiality is maintained by the school. It's really, I think, a sacred obligation, a solemn obligation on a teacher to whom a child discloses or about whom there are concerns to keep that confidential, because the child has, experienced enough suffering and the family themselves will be distressed as well. So it's very important that teachers, caretakers, indeed whoever it is in the school, but particularly teaching staff, should only share the information on a needs-to-know basis. So that's why there are procedures whereby if I'm a teacher and I become aware of something, I go to the DLP. I don't bring it to the staff room and talk about it. If a child is at risk of harm, they can't be guaranteed confidentiality. I suppose that's an important distinction to make. If a child says to a teacher, I want to tell you something, but will you keep it a secret? We would advise them to say, if you're at risk in some way, if you're at risk of harm, or if someone else is at risk of harm, then I can't keep it, but I'll do my best to help you. In relation to confidentiality, in the old guidelines that I used to work under as a guidance counsellor, it used to specifically tell you that if you were sending in a referral to the HSE, don't tell the parents. I think it was the kind of, I don't know quite where that was coming from. But the new Children First and the new DS guidelines really focus on a much more collaborative, open relationship with parents. So if a DLP in a school has to send in a report to the HSE, they must notify the parents immediately. The only time they wouldn't do that would be if they felt that by notifying the parents would be to further endanger a child. So say, for example, a child was severely at risk from within its own family. The school might take a decision to contact the HSE but not to notify the parents. But in that case, they have to note why they didn't do that. There has to be a record. Okay, if the teacher has concerns, he or she should, without delay, report it to the designated liaison person, and that should be followed up in writing. Written reports should be brought to the principal's office and stored in a safe location, so that, again, in the interest of confidentiality and for a consistent record. So to come back then to the designated liaison person, this key person in your school, it's advised that the DLP should be the principal. And generally, in our experience, it is the principal. It may not always be at the beginning, but generally it is there. If the DLP isn't there, is out at a meeting or is away for a few days, it's important that there's somebody to pick up that responsibility should the DLP not be in the school. And that would generally be the deputy principal, who will be the deputy designated liaison person. Somebody said to me the other day, if the principal and the principal are out, do they need to have a deputy designated liaison person? I was told by the HSE that that wasn't necessary, much to the relief of the school. Both of those people will have received training. Every school in the country has attended 2 days of, the DLP or the deputy DLP will have attended 2 days of training in things like recognition of signs and symptoms, handling disclosures, record keeping, time for principals to raise some of the issues that they may find difficult to find. A new thing in these new guidelines, and I'm coming on to this, I should have said at the very beginning, there's not a huge number of changes in the new guidelines from the old ones. So if you know them, if you know the old guidelines, you won't see masses of changes. The key changes I've referred to throughout the slide. And one change as of last week is that the name of the DLP, and I think the deputy DLP, must now be displayed near the main entrance to the school. I don't think that was the case in schools up until now, whereas I've often been into churches and I've seen on the inside of the door, you know, who the child protection officer is. So that's a change in the 2011 guidelines, so you should expect to see that quite soon. It means, I suppose, there's a recognition factor. You know if you're concerned about a child, not necessarily even your own child, somebody else's child, you can go to that DLP and speak to them. So if the DLP receives a referral, if I'm a teacher and I've been told something by a child or I've reason to be concerned and I've spoken to my DLP and I've given them something in writing, the DLP takes this report and notifies the HSE. Now, there are often a lot of grey areas where the DLP is not really sure. It's a very, very, very responsible role, I think, to be a DLP. If they're unsure, they can consult the duty social worker in confidence without naming the child and then act on their advice. So they can pick up the phone and they can say, I'm concerned about a child, I don't want to mention their name just yet. I want to tell you what I'm worried about and will you advise me what to do? And then the DLP must follow the advice of that social worker, because it isn't the role of schools to investigate, neither are we child protection experts. The HSE are the people with the expertise and we need to follow their advice. If there is an emergency, if a child says, I'm afraid to go home because I might be beaten, I might come to some harm, and it's a Friday and you can't get the social worker, the DLP should contact the Gardaí, and they have a service for taking care of children in that very risky situation. Okay, I think I just have a couple of more slides. I said that already about the referral. If the referral is made, the parent should be notified. I suppose sometimes it seems like a concern about a child comes in, it goes onto a piece of paper, the HSE is informed, and then the parents find out about it. In reality, in my experience, it's not usually like that in schools. What usually is the case is that there has been ongoing conversations with parents. There might have been a number of reasons to be concerned about the child. They may have lost weight, they may be very withdrawn. You know, often it's a two-way conversation, and certainly you'll see in the last couple of slides, I would certainly urge yourselves as parents and any parents that you work with, if you have concerns about a child, your own or another person's child, particularly your own, but I mean, if there are significant concerns about another child, that you would, you'd have a discussion. You'd be talking to the yearhead, maybe you'd be talking to the guidance counsellor. So very rarely will it be an out of the blue thing that a school will suddenly have to pick up the phone and say, I've had to send in a referral. But it may be. There may be circumstances where a completely unexpected disclosure is made by a child, and that very difficult news then has to be broken to the parent. In relation to the role of the board, the DLP should also inform the board or VUC that a referral has been made. One of the new provisions in these guidelines is that child protection issues have to be on the agenda of every board of management meeting, and the DLP has to report at every meeting any referrals that he or she might have had to make. But there is no need for the DLP to give any identifying details. Again, it's in relation to the confidentiality. So the principal would simply say a referral has been made to the HSE, the details are on file, and that's all the board need to know. It's really to reassure the board, I suppose, that the school is addressing any issues that come up. So the last two slides relate to parents, and I have hopefully I have filtered through the talk reference to parents. These new Department of Education procedures, for the first time, I don't think either of the other two documents specifically advises schools to develop a practice of openness with parents and to encourage parental involvement. So that's a new emphasis in this document, and a very welcome one. And again, parents can and obviously do reciprocate. Tell the school, as I've said repeatedly, if you're concerned about your child, if you have worries about the child. It may not be that you go straight to the principal, but it might be that you speak to whoever the yearhead is or the appropriate person. I suppose it's important for parents to understand that if a referral of a concern is passed on to the HSE by a school, it's not an allegation or an accusation. It's simply, this has come to our attention, we are passing this concern on. It's not pointing the finger, it's not accusing, and teachers and DLPs are very strongly advised to only record what they have seen and heard, not to conjecture, not to speculate, not to say, I think this happened. And it is the obligation of a school, and obviously that obligation will probably become a statutory obligation once the legislation changes. So the school has an obligation to act in the best interests of the child by following these new procedures. The other change in the 11 guidelines is that the new DS procedures require the school to ensure that the Parents Association receives a copy of the child protection policy every year. That's probably the most significant change. Not that you are not that they're asked to give it to you every year, but that schools are now asked to have a child protection policy. Previous to the new guidelines, I don't know if any of you saw the 2004 guidelines, they're kind of a dark blue book. And when some people obviously have seen it, when we were delivering training to DLPs, we were told to say, that's your policy, adopt that as your policy. The biggest change in the 2011 guidelines is that there's a policy template at the back of the guidelines. You'll see it if you go to the Department of Education website. And basically a school has to state there that who the DLP is, that this policy has been reviewed. There's kind of a checklist at the back of the guidelines. Every year the school has to go through this checklist and make sure parents' associations have been given the new copy, that the board is addressing it at meetings, and that kind of thing. So that's probably the biggest change. That, the name at the door, and but I did mention it earlier. Okay, so again, parents can familiarise themselves. You know, the more you know, the better, the more empowered you are. And as I said at the very beginning, all post-primary schools have pastoral care structures, care teams, guidance counsellors and chaplains. So talk to them if you're worried about your child. I hope that's given you a little bit of a better idea of what schools are doing and your role in that process.